My name is Carrie, and today I am going to show you how to wind a warp for dyeing. Sometimes weavers like to have a painted warp for weaving a scarf, and I'm going to show you the right way to do this, at least my way. Okay, so we're going to make an 8-inch wide warp at 24 ends per inch. I am using 8 threads at a time in my warping paddle. You can see I have my threads in my paddle, two in the eyes, 2 in the slots, 2 in the eyes, and 2 in the slots. And I try to leave a little space between each 2 threads. This helps to keep the warp threads from sticking. Okay, so we're going to wind a 4-yard warp today. So I'm going to put it on the pegs. I got a little slip knot here. Okay. And then I'm going to put my fingers between the 4 groups of threads. So there's 2 groups on top and 2 on the bottom. Okay. I'm going to hold the paddle, and I'm going to alternate the threads to make my cross. So we've got 4 threads up and 4 threads down for the cross. So here's 1 yard, 2 yards, 3 yards, 4 and 4 yards. And I've just made another cross on this end too. I like to put a cross at both ends. I've been winding warps this way for a really long time, so I just about can't do it any other way. So now that I'm at the end, I'm going to switch hands. I'm going to put my fingers again between the 2 groups of threads, hold the paddle, make my cross. So I'm going to go back, make my cross, and wind these. Okay, now I'm going to do this in groupings because you have to be able to put your ties in so that your warp threads will not get tangled when you're dyeing them. So I'm going to do 13 groups, 5 in my first set, 4 and then 4. So this was 1 set. Okay? So we've got 1. Now we're going to go back and do it again. Okay, go around, make my cross, go over, separate, make my cross, go back. Now I am using 8-2 Tencel for this warp. The Tencel takes the dye really nicely, but it is kind of fuzzy, just a little bit. It has a tendency to want to stick together when you're warping. It's almost like the fibers kind of grab each other and create a little knot, and that can make it hard to wind a warp this way. So when I'm setting up my paddle, I try to make sure that I don't have my warp twisted. You can kind of see it. They come straight down and straight up to the paddle. Here. So you can see there's no real twist. Oops. Okay, get this in here. So let me go around again. So here's what I'm trying to tell you. The threads come straight up and into the paddle. The paddle's not twisted around. If you try to warp with the paddle twisted like this, with the threads twisting, your threads will stick together and it's going to create some real problems for you. So it's important to make sure that the threads come straight up to the paddle, that they're not twisting when you wind. even then they still tend to stick, but you want to minimize that as much as possible. Now I have 5 sets done, and I'm going to start tying my ties to keep the warp, to keep it so that it won't cause you problems when you're dyeing it. When you're painting a warp, you're going to be soaking it in solution, and then you're going to be squirting your dyes on after you've wrung that solution out. And you want your warp to be able to lay flat and as tangle-free as possible. So this is going to help control that. So what I'm doing is every yard I'm putting in ties. So if this was half a yard, this is a yard, and this is 3 yards. So I like to use like a 3-2 cotton for this. I double it over, and then I just kind of flip it over there, and I tie a little slip knot. I'm not done with this. This is just temporary. And these are about 2 yards in length. This is just the habit I've gotten into. You can do it any way you want, but this works well for me. So now I have kind of a control tie at every yard. So here's 1 yard, 2 yards, 3 yards. If you were making a longer warp, you'd have more ties. Now, when you do this in the end, I'll show you, you're going to have them loose so that they won't keep the dye from penetrating the fibers. And actually, by winding on 8 threads at a time, this speeds the process up tremendously. I don't think I could paint warps the way I do, as many as I paint, if I had to wind 1 thread at a time. This would take me forever, 1 thread at a time. So I always wind multiple threads whenever possible. I try to buy enough cones or buy smaller cones in multiples to make this easier for myself. I also try to be very careful when I'm winding this around to not go over, instead go under. I want them to be able to lay in a single layer, and if you're overlapping too much, it's going to make your threads longer than others, and that's going to be a problem. You want to keep your threads as much as the same length as possible. So I always try very hard to go under. And you can't always do that, but you can see I'm kind of layering it under. And just do the best you can do. Okay, that's 4 more. So we're going to tie our next tie. So I've just taken out the slip knot, flip that over, pull them up, and tie it. in. Okay. Now, you can choose to just do one cross. That's totally up to you. But like I said, I've been doing this for so long. It's ingrained in me, 2 crosses. It gives you some options for when you're putting this on your loom, which end goes on which part of the loom. I like to put the uncut end at the back of the loom because I put my warp on back to front. So when I do that, this end will be the uncut end and it will go on the back over the rod. And then the rest of this will go in the rattle. And since I've got the threads 4x4 and I have 12 ends in every 1/2 inch, it makes it easier for me to space it in the rattle. One more and we'll be done. Okay, that's it for winding. Now we got to tie it up. Okay. So this is all very important, this part here. First I'm going to tie this end, tie it securely. I like to put 3 or 4 knots in just to make sure it's not going to come out. And actually sometimes I think this whole part takes me longer than actually winding the warp. So what I'm going to do first, tie off these. Now, I like to leave a couple inches room below the warp because when you spread this out on the table after you've had it soaking, you want to be able to spread it flat, as flat as possible, as much as a single layer as possible. If you have this really tight, the dye is not going to be able to get to the warp and you're going to have white spots. You don't want that. So it has to be fairly loose. It has to have the ability to be loose. So leave about 2 inches, 2 to 3 inches length underneath your warp to your knot. And I just use a little overhand knot. And do the same with these. Now I've got to tie up the crosses. They're pretty close to the end, so most likely this part, it'll either be in your fringe or you'll be cutting it off as loom waste. So you don't really have to worry about keeping it real loose, but I still like to leave room. Because, when you have, even at the end, when you have that big bundle, if you can't lay it out flat, or fairly flat, it's probably going to cause you some issues. So first I tie, my first tie in the center, around the cross. So we're preserving the cross. And then I like to tie each group. So these ends that I cut off, I'm going to use first. One more. Okay, and now for this one. Let's make a little ring here. So tie your cross. And tie each leg. I guess that's a good word as any. I know it's probably a little hard to see. One more. Okay, so 5 ties, and I got my 5 ties here, just double checking to make sure I've got them all. Now I'm going to take this off. This is really important, this part too. Before you take it off, let me show you this. There's a little cross here, but it's not a whole cross, it's part of a cross. Same here. I'm going to show you what to do with that. So first I'm going to take this off, and I'm going to tie some overhand knots just for a temporary thing to keep this together so you don't end up with tangles. Okay. I'm going to slip it off here, but I'm going to leave it on this last peg for a second. Well, actually, what I'm going to do is I am going to get rid of that extra cross. So I pull it off, pull it open, and put it back on. And what's happened here is the groupings of 4 threads have, when you open it up like that and you get rid of that second cross, the threads are interlocked around each other like this. Like this. So it's important to get rid of that extra cross. You need to get that out of there. And just remember, that's how they are. They're locked against each other. We do the same thing on this side. Take one of the legs, pull it open. There, like that. Okay? So here's your cross. Right here. Right here. Now, this is the most important part, I think, of what you need to know when you're doing this, besides the ties. You need to tie the ends so that they cannot slip out when you have this in the water. If you don't tie these correctly, you're going to have real problems when you're rinsing your warp out. I mean, you're putting this in water. You want to minimize tangling as much as possible. So what I'm doing is I'm tying a really tight knot here at the top. And then I'm going to tie another really tight tie here at the end. I'm going to make it good and tight. going to probably cut these off anyway when you're weaving. So it doesn't matter that there's going to be blank spots where the dye doesn't go through. But this will keep any possibility of any grouping of slipping through. They can't slip through this knot when you've got them tied together like this up here. This is so important. I once, when I was first doing this, I made the mistake of putting my warp in the washing machine. I know that sounds really, really stupid, but the amazing thing was I had it tied like this, and I was able, it looked like a bunch of spaghetti when it came out, but I was able to straighten it out because I still had these ties in the warp, and it saved it. It was amazing. I would never do that again though. Never, never, never put your warp in the washing machine. That's a really dumb idea, but I guess I wanted to see what would happen if I could save myself some work. It made a lot more work at the end. So I do this on both ends. And I mean, the whole purpose of doing this is to minimize tangling, because it's not fun to try to take tangles out of your warp. Okay, so now I've got my cut end where I've tied it together, and I've got my uncut end. I'm going to put this on my peg, and I'm going to chain my warp. So what I do is I kind of make an overhand knot at this first end. I'm going to ignore all those ties in there. It's not going to hurt anything. I'm going to pull the warp through and make a new, I'm just going to chain. And I have a little bit of tension pulling against the hook. And as I do this, my warp is going to twist. That's okay. When I was first doing this, I would be twisting the warp back around to untwist it, but then when I would undo the chain, the whole warp would be twisted, and it would be almost like a permanent thing. So let the warp twist now. When you undo the chain, the twist comes out. It's not going to hurt anything. This will keep the warp nice and neat until I'm ready to paint it. Another thing I'll go ahead and tell you now, when you go to soak this warp before you paint, take the chain out first. If you don't take the chain out, then you're going to have problems, because a warp that's wet, a wet warp, is much harder to untangle than a warp that is not free. I mean, when you put your warp into soak, you want it to get the water, the soda ash solution, to get to all the fiber. When you've got it chained, it's going to not work the way you need it to. It needs to be unchained. So that is how you make a warp, and it is prepared for dyeing. Thanks.